Sometimes the most dangerous thing about a small town isn't what happens in the shadows, it's what happens in broad daylight when everyone's watching. Sarah Mitchell learned this the hard way when she moved to Copper Ridge, Arizona, thinking she could disappear into the desert and leave her past behind. But some ghosts follow you no matter how far you run, and some protectors appear when you least expect them. What started as stolen glances across a dusty main street would become a story of survival, unexpected love, and the kind of courage that only emerges when everything you care about is on the line. In a place where everyone knows everyone else's business, the most important conversations happen in silence, through looks that say everything words cannot. This is the story of a woman running from her demons, a cowboy who saw more than he should have, and the dangerous game of cat and mouse that threatened to destroy them both. Sometimes being watched isn't about control, sometimes it's about protection. And, sometimes, the person you're most afraid of becoming is exactly who you need to be to survive. Sarah Mitchell's hands shook as she poured coffee for the third customer that morning, the ceramic mug rattling against the counter of Miller's Diner. 3 weeks in Copper Ridge, Arizona, and she still jumped at every unexpected sound, every door chime, every shadow that moved wrong across the restaurant's sun-bleached windows. The bruises on her ribs had faded to a sickly yellow, but the memory of how she got them remained sharp as broken glass. "You all right there, honey?" asked Dolores, the diner's owner, her weathered face creased with concern. At 62, Dolores had seen enough broken people drift through her establishment to recognize the signs. She'd hired Sarah without asking too many questions, understanding that sometimes a person needed a fresh start more than they needed a perfect resume. Sarah forced a smile, the same practiced expression she'd perfected over 2 years of marriage to Marcus. "Just tired. Still getting used to the altitude." It wasn't entirely a lie. Copper Ridge sat at 4,000 feet above sea level, nestled in a valley between red rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels guarding the town's secrets. The air was thin and dry, nothing like the humid coastal climate of her former life in San Diego. Everything here was different, the landscape, the people, the pace of life that moved like honey in winter. Through the large front window, she could see Main Street stretching out in both directions, a ribbon of cracked asphalt lined with buildings that had weathered decades of desert storms. The hardware store, the post office, the single bank that served the surrounding ranches, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where strangers stood out like neon signs in the darkness. Which was exactly why she'd chosen it. Sarah had researched small towns across the Southwest for weeks before landing on Copper Ridge. Population 847. One main road in, one main road out. No major highways nearby, no airports within 100 miles. The kind of place Marcus would never think to look for her, assuming he was even looking anymore. She tried not to think about that last night, about the sound her phone had made when it hit the kitchen wall, about the way Marcus had smiled when she'd flinched. He'd been drinking more lately, staying out later, coming home with scratches on his knuckles and stories that didn't add up. The pharmaceutical company where he worked as a sales rep provided the perfect cover for his increasingly frequent disappearances. "Sarah." Dolores's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Table 6 needs a refill." Table 6. Sarah glanced over and immediately wished she hadn't. The man sitting alone in the corner booth had been watching her again, those steel gray eyes tracking her movements with the intensity of a predator studying prey. He'd been coming in every day since her second week on the job, always ordering the same thing, black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast. Always sitting in the same booth where he could see both the front door and the kitchen entrance. Jake Morrison looked like he'd stepped out of a Western movie. Tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of hard physical work and hands that looked like they could gentle a spooked horse or break a man's jaw with equal efficiency. His dark hair was always slightly mussed, as if he'd just pulled off his Stetson, and his face carried the kind of weathered lines that came from squinting into desert sun and facing down whatever life threw at you. Sarah had heard the whispers, the way people talked about him and the careful tones reserved for local legends. Jake Morrison, who'd inherited the Broken Arrow Ranch from his grandfather and turned it into one of the most successful cattle operations in the county. Jake Morrison, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to bury his parents and take over the family business. Jake Morrison, who kept to himself and trusted no one completely. And Jake Morrison, who watched Sarah Mitchell like his life depended on memorizing every detail of her existence. She approached his table with the coffee pot, trying to keep her expression neutral. "More coffee?" He nodded, those gray eyes never leaving her face. "Thank you." His voice was low, gravelly, with the slight drawl that seemed to be standard issue for everyone born within 100 miles of Copper Ridge. Sarah poured the coffee, hyper-aware of how close she had to stand to reach his cup, how the scent of leather and sage seemed to cling to his clothes. "You're new in town," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's grip tightened on the coffee pot. "Yes." "Where'd you come from?" The question she'd been dreading. She'd rehearsed the answer a dozen times, but, under his steady gaze, the words felt clumsy and obvious. "California. Los Angeles area. Long way from home." Sometimes a long way is exactly what you need. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Did he know? Could he see through her carefully constructed story about wanting a simpler life, about being tired of the city's pace and pollution? This town can be. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, protective of its own. But it can also be hard on outsiders. People here don't forget easily, and they don't trust quickly. Sarah met his gaze directly for the first time since she'd started working at the diner. "And which category do I fall into?" Still trying to figure that out. Before she could respond, the diner's bell chimed, and Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. The man who walked through the door was tall, well-dressed in a way that screamed money and power, with dark hair perfectly styled and a smile that never reached his eyes. For one heart-stopping moment, she thought Marcus had found her. Then, the stranger turned, and she saw that while he shared Marcus's basic build and coloring, he was someone else entirely. But the relief was short-lived. Because if men like Marcus existed in a place like Copper Ridge, then maybe her sanctuary wasn't as safe as she'd believed. The newcomer scanned the diner with the practiced eye of someone used to evaluating situations quickly. His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than necessary, taking in her uniform, her nervous posture, the way she'd gone pale at his entrance. Then, he smiled, the expression predatory and knowing. "Afternoon," he said to Dolores as he approached the counter. "I'm looking for someone." A woman, about 5'6", brunette, probably using a different name than the one she was born with. Sarah's hands began to tremble so violently she had to set down the coffee pot. This was it. This was how it ended. 3 weeks of freedom, of sleep without nightmares, of mornings without checking to make sure she hadn't said or done anything to set Marcus off. "Sounds like half the women in this county," Dolores replied dryly. "You got anything more specific?" The man pulled out a photograph, and Sarah's world tilted sideways. It was her wedding photo, the one that had sat on Marcus's nightstand until she'd thrown it in the trash the night before she ran. She looked so young in the image, so hopeful, wearing a white dress and a smile that belonged to someone who still believed in happy endings. Her name was Sarah Hoffman, the stranger continued. But she might be using her maiden name now. Mitchell. She's my brother-in-law's wife, and the family's very worried about her. She left San Diego about a month ago without telling anyone where she was going. Sarah's legs went weak. Marcus had sent someone to find her. Of course he had. She should have known that disappearing wouldn't be enough, that Marcus wouldn't just let her go. He was too controlling, too possessive, too convinced of his own importance to simply accept that she'd left him. From the corner of her eye, she saw Jake Morrison shift in his booth, his posture changing from relaxed observation to coiled readiness. Those gray eyes moved between Sarah and the stranger, and she could practically see him putting pieces together in his mind. "Can't say I recognize her," Dolores said, but her voice had taken on the flat, careful tone of someone who is lying. "But I'll keep an eye out. You got a card or something, in case she turns up?" The man handed over a business card with a smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Daniel Vance. Private investigator. I'd appreciate a call if you see anything." After he left, the diner fell silent except for the hum of the ancient air conditioner and the sizzle of bacon on the grill. Sarah stood frozen by Jake's table, staring at the coffee pot in her hands as if she'd never seen one before. "Sarah! Jake's voice was so quiet she almost missed it. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, and what she saw there surprised her. Not suspicion or judgment, but something that looked almost like fury, not directed at her, but on her behalf. "How bad?" he asked. The question was simple, but the weight behind it suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. "Bad enough that I changed my name and drove 1,500 miles to get away from it." Jake nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "The PI who was just here, he's not law enforcement." "How do you know?" "Because I know what real cops look like, and I know what hired muscle looks like when it's wearing an expensive suit." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "Sarah, if that man finds you, what happens?" She closed her eyes, remembering the weight of Marcus's hands around her throat, the way he'd whispered that she belonged to him, that she'd never be free of him no matter where she went. Nothing good. When she opened her eyes, Jake was studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Then, he pulled out his wallet, dropped a 20 on the table, and stood up. At his full height, he was even more imposing, broad shoulders filling out his flannel shirt, worn jeans hugging his legs like they'd been tailored specifically for him. "My ranch is about 10 miles north of town," he said. "Broken Arrow. Anyone can give you directions. If you need somewhere safe to think, somewhere that man won't find you, you're welcome there." Sarah stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." He settled his hat on his head, the gesture somehow managing to be both casual and deliberate. "And, Sarah? That PI isn't going to give up easy. Men like that, they get paid to be persistent. You might want to think about what comes next." He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her. "One more thing. If you decide to trust me, there's something you should know. I've got experience dealing with men who hurt women. And I've got resources that a diner waitress doesn't." Then, he was gone, leaving Sarah standing there with a head full of questions and a heart that was beating so fast she thought it might burst. Because Jake Morrison had just offered her something she'd never had before, protection from someone who asked for nothing in return. The question was whether she was brave enough to accept it. Outside, the Arizona sun blazed down on Main Street, turning the asphalt into a shimmering river of heat. Somewhere out there, Daniel Vance was making phone calls, asking questions, getting closer to the truth. And, somewhere back in San Diego, Marcus was waiting for word that his missing wife had been found. But, for the first time since she'd run away, Sarah didn't feel completely alone. And, maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to keep her one step ahead of the nightmare that was trying to catch up to her. The bell above the diner door chimed again, and Sarah's head snapped up, her body tensing for flight. But, it was just Mrs. Henderson from the post office, coming in for her usual afternoon pie and gossip. Sarah took a deep breath and picked up the coffee pot. Whatever came next, she'd face it. She'd already survived the worst thing she could imagine. Everything else was just details. Even if those details included a cowboy with steel gray eyes who'd somehow seen straight through her carefully constructed facade and offered her the one thing she'd never dared to hope for, a chance to stop running. The knock on Sarah's apartment door came at 2:17 in the morning, soft but insistent. She'd been lying awake anyway, staring at the water stain on her ceiling that looked like a bird in flight, trying not to think about Daniel Vance and what his presence in Copper Ridge meant for her carefully constructed new life. Sarah had rented the small studio above Murphy's hardware store using the last of her savings and a fake reference she created using a burner phone and a lot of creative storytelling. It wasn't much, barely 400 square feet with a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a mini fridge, but it was hers. The first place in her adult life that Marcus had never set foot in, never contaminated with his presence. The knocking came again, and Sarah's heart began to race. She crept to the window and peered through the blinds. Main Street was empty except for a familiar pickup truck parked under the streetlight. Jake Morrison's truck. She opened the door to find him standing there in jeans and a dark t-shirt, his hair mussed as if he'd dressed quickly. In his hands, he held a thermos and what looked like a sandwich wrapped in paper. "Figured you might not be sleeping," he said quietly. Sarah glanced up and down the street, then stepped aside to let him in. How did you know where I live? Small town. Dolores mentioned you were renting from Murphy. Jake's eyes swept over the sparse apartment, taking in the single suitcase that held all her worldly possessions, the mattress on the floor, the complete absence of personal items that might indicate a life lived rather than endured. Coffee, he said, offering her the thermos. And roast beef. Figured you might have missed dinner. She had missed dinner, too nervous to eat after the encounter with Vance. But accepting food from Jake felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with her situation with Marcus and everything to do with the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her. Why are you here? She asked, not taking the offered items. Jake set the thermos and sandwich on her small table and turned to face her fully. Because that PI spent the afternoon asking questions all over town. Showed your picture to the postmaster, the bank manager, even old Pete at the gas station. Someone's going to recognize you eventually. So you came to tell me to run again? No. His voice was firm, final. I came to tell you that you don't have to. Sarah sank onto the edge of her mattress, suddenly, exhausted. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. Then, explain it to me. She looked up at him, this man who'd somehow inserted himself into her crisis without being asked, who'd offered protection without knowing what he was protecting her from. Jake Morrison was an enigma, successful enough to own one of the largest ranches in the county, yet present enough in her daily life to notice when she was afraid. Powerful enough to make promises about safety, yet gentle enough to bring her food in the middle of the night. His name is Marcus Hoffman, she began, the words feeling strange in her mouth after weeks of trying to forget them. We were married for 2 years. He's a pharmaceutical sales representative, which means he travels constantly and has contacts in every major city on the West Coast. Jake pulled out the single chair at her table and sat down, giving her his full attention. At first, it was small things, Sarah continued. He didn't like my friends, said they were a bad influence. He thought I spent too much money on groceries, that I talked too much when we went out to dinner. He had opinions about my clothes, my hair, the way I laughed. She wrapped her arms around herself, remembering. I told myself it was because he loved me, because he wanted me to be the best version of myself. That's what love looked like in the movies, right? Someone who cared enough to help you improve? When did it escalate? Jake's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into loose fists. About 6 months into the marriage. I got a job at an art gallery downtown, and Marcus didn't like that I was meeting new people, talking to customers, having experiences he wasn't part of. He said I was becoming selfish, that married women should focus on their homes, not on careers. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. The first time he hit me, I actually apologized to him. Can you believe that? I apologized because I thought I must have done something wrong, must have pushed him too far. Behind her, she heard Jake's chair scrape against the floor, but he didn't speak. It got worse after that. He'd come home from business trips angry about something that had happened with a client or a colleague, and I became his outlet for that anger. He'd accuse me of things, talking to other men, spending money without permission, not keeping the house clean enough. And, when I tried to defend myself. She turned back to Jake, and his expression made her breath catch. Those steel gray eyes held a fury so cold and controlled it was almost frightening. How many times did he put you in the hospital? He asked. He was careful about that. Marcus is smart, educated, charming when he needs to be. He knew where to hit so the bruises wouldn't show, knew how to hurt me without leaving evidence. Sarah's voice had gone flat, clinical. The last night, he wrapped his hands around my throat and told me that I belonged to him, that if I ever tried to leave, he'd find me and make sure I never tried it again. Jake stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. So you ran. I waited until he left for a 3-day conference in Phoenix. Withdrew what I could from our joint account, packed one suitcase, and drove east until I found this place. She managed a weak smile. I thought 1,500 miles would be enough. It should have been. Jake moved closer, not enough to crowd her but enough that she could see the golden flecks in his gray eyes. Sarah, the man who came looking for you today, he's not just a private investigator. I made some calls after he left the diner. Her stomach clenched. What kind of calls? I still have contacts from my army days. People who know how to find information quickly and quietly. Jake's expression was grim. Daniel Vance has connections to some dangerous people. The kind of people who do more than just find missing persons. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. You think Marcus hired him to? I think Marcus hired him to bring you back, whatever it takes. Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sage and leather that seemed to cling to his skin. Sarah, men like your ex-husband, they don't give up. They escalate. And if he's desperate enough to hire someone like Vance, then this situation is more dangerous than just an abusive husband looking for his wife. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that Marcus was awful but not murderous. But she remembered the look in her husband's eyes that last night, the way his hands had tightened around her throat, the smile that had crossed his face when she'd started to struggle for air. What am I supposed to do? She whispered. You're supposed to let me help you. Why? The question burst out of her, born from months of isolation and fear. Why would you do that for someone you barely know? What do you want from me? Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to decide how much truth she could handle. Finally, he spoke. My mother was married before she met my father. Her first husband was a lot like your Marcus, charming on the surface, controlling underneath. It took her 3 tries to leave him, and, the third time, she nearly didn't make it. Sarah's breath caught. What happened? My grandfather happened. He was a hard man, but he had a code about protecting family. When my mother showed up at the ranch with a black eye and a broken wrist, Grandpa made it clear that her ex-husband wasn't welcome in this county anymore. Jake's smile was sharp, predatory. The ex took the hint and moved to Oregon. Never bothered her again. So this is about your mother. This is about doing what's right. Jake moved even closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Sarah, I've been watching you since your first day at the diner. Not because I'm some creep who preys on vulnerable women, but because I recognize the signs. The way you flinch when someone moves too fast. The way you scan every room for exits. The way you apologize for things that aren't your fault. Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. You've been analyzing me. I've been concerned about you. There's a difference. His voice gentled. And, watching you try to rebuild your life, try to find some peace in this little town, it reminds me that there are still things worth protecting in this world. Sarah stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. You don't even know if I'm worth protecting. What if I'm not the innocent victim you think I am? What if I did something to deserve what Marcus did to me? Jake's response was immediate and fierce. Nothing. You did nothing to deserve being hurt by someone who was supposed to love you. His hands came up to frame her face, calloused thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. Sarah, I've seen real evil in this world. I've looked into the eyes of men who take pleasure in causing pain, who use their power to destroy instead of protect. And I'm looking at you right now, and that's not what I see. What do you see? I see someone who's spent so long being told she was worthless that she actually believes it. Someone who's forgotten that she deserves to be safe, to be happy, to wake up in the morning without being afraid of what the day might bring. Tears burned behind Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. And you think you can give me that? Safety and happiness and peaceful mornings? I think you can give those things to yourself, with the right support. Jake's thumbs traced across her skin again, the touch so gentle it made her heart ache. I'm just offering to watch your back while you figure out how. The cowboy thing again, she managed, trying to lighten the moment before it overwhelmed her completely. The cowboy thing, he agreed, his smile transforming his entire face. Though I prefer to think of it as being a decent human being. Sarah closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, allowing herself to imagine what it might feel like to be safe, to be protected by someone who asked for nothing in return. When she opened her eyes again, Jake was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite identify. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Vance isn't working alone. I saw them talking to someone outside the motel earlier, tall guy, expensive car, looked like muscle trying to pass for businessman. They're planning something, and it's going to happen soon." The brief moment of peace shattered. "How do you know?" "Because I know how these things work. They've found you, which means the clock is ticking. Either they try to take you quietly, or they escalate and involve local law enforcement with some story about a mentally unstable woman who needs to be returned to her family." Sarah pulled away from his hands, panic rising in her throat. "So I run again. Tonight. Right now." "No." Jake's voice was firm. "You're done running. It's time to make a stand." "I'm not a fighter, Jake. I'm not brave or strong or any of the things you seem to think I am. You drove 1,500 miles alone to start over with nothing but a suitcase and a dream of being free," he said. "You got a job, found a place to live, and started rebuilding your life from scratch. You've been living with fear for months, and you're still here, still breathing, still hoping for something better." He moved to the window and peered through the blinds, his body tense and alert. "Sarah, if that's not brave, I don't know what is." Outside, a car drove slowly past her building, its headlights sweeping across the walls of her apartment. Jake watched it disappear around the corner, then turned back to her. "Pack whatever you can't live without," he said. "You're coming with me tonight. To your ranch. To my ranch. Where I've got security cameras, motion detectors, and enough firepower to convince Vance and his friend that they'd be better off looking for you somewhere else." Sarah stared at him, this man who'd somehow become her protector without being asked, who was offering her sanctuary in a world that had taught her to trust no one. "And what happens after that? I can't hide on your ranch forever. We figure out a permanent solution. Together." Jake moved to her suitcase and began folding the few items of clothing scattered around the apartment. "But first, we make sure you survive the night." As if summoned by his words, the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the street below. Jake was at the window instantly, his body coiled for action. "Two men," he said quietly. "One of them is Vance. They're heading for the hardware store entrance." Sarah's legs went weak. "They found me." "They found where you live," Jake corrected. "But they're not going to find you." He moved with swift efficiency, shouldering her suitcase and grabbing the thermos from the table. "Is there a back way out of this building?" Sarah nodded, her mind finally catching up to the urgency of the situation. "Fire escape. Leads to the alley behind Murphy's store." "Good. We're taking it." As they moved toward the window that led to the fire escape, Sarah could hear footsteps on the stairs below, voices arguing in hushed tones about the best way to approach her door. Her hands shook as she wrestled with the old window latch. Jake's hands covered hers, steady and warm. "Hey! Look at me!" She met his eyes, and some of her panic receded at the calm confidence she saw there. "We're going to be okay," he said. "I've got you now, and I don't let go of things I care about." "Things I care about." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were painful but because they were precious. When was the last time someone had cared about her well-being without expecting something in return? The window finally gave way, and Jake helped her climb through onto the metal grating of the fire escape. The desert air was cool against her skin, filled with the scent of sage and distant rain. Behind them, they could hear pounding on her apartment door, Daniel Vance's voice calling her name in tones that managed to be both friendly and threatening. "Sarah Mitchell, we just want to talk. Your husband is very worried about you." Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept moving, guiding her down the fire escape with practiced silence. They reached the alley just as the pounding upstairs grew more insistent. Jake's truck was parked 2 blocks away, hidden behind the town's only church. As they climbed into the cab, Sarah could see lights coming on in windows throughout the downtown area, residents awakened by the commotion at Murphy's hardware store. Where are we going? She asked as Jake started the engine. Home, he said simply. To the Broken Arrow. As they drove through the empty streets of Copper Ridge, Sarah watched her apartment building disappear in the side mirror. Somewhere up there, Daniel Vance and his companion were discovering that their quarry had flown the coop. The realization should have terrified her, but, instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Relief. For the first time since she'd left San Diego, she wasn't running alone. The Broken Arrow Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of high desert, its main house sitting like a fortress on a hill overlooking miles of open grassland. As Jake's truck wound up the gravel drive, Sarah caught glimpses of cattle moving like shadows in the moonlight, their presence somehow comforting in the vast landscape. The house itself was larger than she'd expected, a rambling structure of weathered wood and native stone that looked like it had grown from the desert floor itself. Solar panels glinted on the roof, and she could see the subtle presence of security cameras mounted at strategic points around the property. Motion sensors cover every approach to the house, Jake explained as they parked. Anyone comes within 200 yards, we'll know about it. Sarah followed him through a solid oak door into a living room that managed to be both rustic and comfortable. Native American rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and the massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. But what caught her attention was the gun safe in the corner, its steel door slightly ajar to reveal a collection of rifles and shotguns. Jake. Her voice was small in the large room. What exactly are you planning to do if Marcus shows up here? He set her suitcase down and turned to face her, his expression serious. Whatever it takes to keep you safe. That's not an answer. Jake was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. Sarah, I told you I served in Afghanistan. What I didn't tell you is that I came home early because I took some shrapnel to my leg during an IED explosion. Spent 6 months in military hospitals, had plenty of time to think about what I wanted to do with my life. He moved to the window that looked out over the ranch, his silhouette dark against the glass. I decided I was done with violence, done with conflict, done with situations where the only solution was to hurt someone else. Came home, took over this ranch, figured I'd spend my days raising cattle and staying out of other people's business. But some fights come looking for you whether you want them or not. He turned back to her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. And some things are worth fighting for. Before Sarah could respond, a soft chime sounded from somewhere in the house. Jake was moving instantly, crossing to a console near the kitchen that displayed feeds from multiple security cameras. 2 vehicles, he said, his voice tight. Coming up the main road. Looks like Vance brought backup. Sarah's heart began to race as she watched the screen. 2 black SUVs were driving slowly toward the ranch, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. How did they find us so fast? GPS tracker on my truck, probably, Jake said grimly. Should have thought of that earlier. The vehicles stopped at the ranch's front gate, about a quarter mile from the house. Even on the grainy security feed, Sarah could see men getting out, dark figures moving with military precision. How many? She asked. 6. Maybe 7. Jake's hands moved over the console, and additional lights came on around the property, illuminating the approaching men in harsh white light. Professional, from the look of them. Sarah's legs gave way, and she sank onto the leather sofa. They're going to kill us. No. Jake's voice was absolute, final. They're not. He moved to the gun safe and began removing weapons, checking each one with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully. There's a safe room in the back of the house, behind the master bedroom. Steel walls, separate phone line, enough supplies to last a week if necessary. You're sending me to hide while you face them alone. I'm sending you somewhere safe while I handle this situation. Sarah stood up, anger flooding through her for the first time in months. No. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not letting someone else fight my battles while I cower in a safe room like a child. Jake paused in his weapon preparation, looking at her with surprise. Sarah, my whole life, I've been letting other people make decisions for me. My parents decided who I should marry. Marcus decided where I should live, what I should wear, who I could talk to. Even you're deciding how this ends, and I'm supposed to just go along with it. She moved to stand in front of him, her hands trembling but her voice steady. I'm done being a victim. If this is going to end tonight, then I want to be part of ending it. Jake stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him reassessing, recognizing something in her that maybe even she hadn't known was there. You ever fire a gun before? He asked. Marcus took me to a shooting range a few times. Said he wanted me to know how to protect myself when he was traveling. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Jake handed her a pistol, a Glock 19 that felt both familiar and foreign in her hands. Safety's here, trigger pull is about 5 pounds. 15 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. A voice echoed across the desert, amplified by some kind of megaphone. Morrison. We know she's in there. Send her out, and nobody has to get hurt. Jake moved to the front window, keeping well back from the glass. That's Vance. Sounds like he's trying to negotiate. What do you think he wants? I think he wants to complete his contract and collect his fee. Question is whether that contract involves bringing you back alive or just proving you're dead. The brutal honesty of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. Then, we don't let him complete it. Jake looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Respect, maybe. Recognition that the frightened woman he'd rescued from the diner was gone, replaced by someone harder, more determined. All right, he said. Here's what we're going to do. The plan was simple, which Jake assured her was the key to most successful military operations. They would use the ranch's terrain to their advantage, drawing Vance's men into a crossfire situation where their superior numbers wouldn't matter as much. Jake had spent years preparing the Broken Arrow for exactly this kind of situation, though he'd never expected to face it with a civilian by his side. Strategic cover points, overlapping fields of fire, multiple escape routes, the ranch was a fortress disguised as a cattle operation. The key is patience, he told Sarah as they moved into position. Let them come to us, make them fight on our terms. They were crouched behind a stone wall that ran along the side of the house, about 50 yards from where the SUVs had stopped. The desert air was cool and still, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle moving restlessly in their pastures. Morrison. Vance's voice carried clearly across the open ground. You're harboring a fugitive. Sarah Hoffman is wanted for questioning in connection with financial crimes. We're authorized to take her into custody. Jake's jaw tightened. Financial crimes. Creative. Sarah checked her pistol again, making sure the safety was off, trying to remember everything Marcus had taught her about sight alignment and trigger control. The irony of using her abuser's lessons against his hired killers wasn't lost on her. What happens if we don't make it through this? She asked quietly. Jake looked at her, his gray eyes serious in the moonlight. We make it through this. But what if we don't? He was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a cell phone. I've already called the sheriff's department. Help is on the way, but it's going to take them at least 20 minutes to get here from town. 20 minutes is a long time in a gunfight. Then, we make sure it doesn't last 20 minutes. Movement caught Sarah's eye, and she saw figures spreading out across the open ground between the gate and the house. Professional, coordinated, moving with the kind of tactical awareness that spoke of military or law enforcement training. Jake, she said softly. These aren't just private investigators. No, he agreed. They're not. The first shots came without warning, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness as bullets sparked off the stone wall above their heads. Sarah pressed herself against the ground, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Jake returned fire with controlled, precise shots, each one carefully aimed. 2 of the approaching figures dove for cover, but the others kept advancing. Sarah, Jake called over the sound of gunfire. Northwest corner of the house. There's a tool shed about 30 yards out. I need you to get to that shed and cover the back approach.
I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving me. You're covering my flank.
A bullet whined past his ear, and he ducked lower. These guys are good, but they're expecting to face one person, not two. We use that advantage. Sarah looked toward the toolshed, calculating the distance and the amount of open ground she'd have to cross. 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles. On my signal, Jake said, then raised his rifle and began laying down covering fire.
Go!
Sarah ran, keeping low, her boots slipping on the desert gravel. Bullets cracked through the air around her, but she made it to the shed without being hit. From her new position, she could see two men approaching the back of the house, thinking they were unseen. Her first shot went wide, the pistol jumping in her hands more than she'd expected. The two men spun toward her, raising their weapons, and, suddenly, everything slowed down. Sarah thought of Marcus's hands around her throat, of the way he'd smiled when she'd begged him to stop, of all the nights she'd lain awake planning an escape she thought would never come. She thought of Jake's quiet strength, his offer of protection, the way he'd made her feel like she was worth saving. Her second shot took the first man in the shoulder, spinning him around. Her third shot dropped the second man entirely.
Nice shooting!
Jake called from his position, and Sarah felt a fierce surge of pride and adrenaline. The gunfight lasted another 10 minutes, a brutal exchange of gunfire across the desert landscape. When the sheriff's department finally arrived, sirens wailing and light bars flashing, they found Jake and Sarah standing over 5 wounded men and Daniel Vance himself, who was nursing a bullet wound to his leg and demanding to speak to his lawyer. In the aftermath, as EMTs treated the wounded and deputies took statements, Sarah learned that Marcus had hired more than just a private investigator. The men who'd come to the Broken Arrow were former military contractors, the kind of people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently.
Your husband wanted you dead, Sheriff Martinez told her bluntly. Vance has already started talking, trying to cut a deal. Apparently, Mr.
Hoffman had a significant life insurance policy on you, and he'd rather collect that money than risk you testifying about the abuse in a divorce proceeding.
Sarah absorbed this information with surprising calm.
Somewhere in the back of her mind, she'd always known that Marcus was capable of escalating to murder. The only surprise was that it had taken him this long to try it.
What happens now? She asked.
Now we arrest Marcus Hoffman for conspiracy to commit murder, and you get to start your life over for real this time. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah stood on the porch of the Broken Arrow ranch house and watched the last of the law enforcement vehicles disappear down the gravel drive. Jake approached from the barn, where he'd been checking on the cattle that had been spooked by the gunfire. His shirt was torn and he had a bandage on his left arm where a bullet had grazed him, but he was smiling. So, he said, settling beside her on the porch steps. What are you going to do now that you're truly free? Sarah considered the question, looking out over the vast landscape that stretched to the horizon. For the first time in her adult life, the future was entirely her own to decide. I think, she said slowly, I'd like to learn how to run a cattle ranch. Jake's smile widened. I might know someone who could teach you. Really? What would this teacher expect in return? Nothing you're not willing to give, he said quietly. And everything you are. Sarah turned to study his profile, this man who'd risked his life to save someone he barely knew, who'd asked for nothing and given everything. Jake Morrison. Yes, ma'am? You keep watching me. He met her gaze, those steel-gray eyes warm with promise and possibility. Maybe I'm just making sure you're safe. And, maybe, Sarah said, leaning closer until she could feel his breath against her lips, I don't mind being watched by the right person. When he kissed her, gentle and sure and full of unspoken promises, Sarah finally understood what freedom really meant. It wasn't just the absence of fear or control or violence. It was the presence of choice, of trust, of someone who saw your worth and helped you see it too. The sun rose higher, burning away the last shadows of the night, and Sarah Mitchell, who was finally, truly Sarah Mitchell again, kissed the cowboy who'd saved her life and began planning the future she'd never dared to dream was possible. In the distance, cattle moved across the grasslands like ships on a green sea, and the desert stretched endlessly toward tomorrow, full of promise and hope and the kind of love that comes when two broken people find they fit together perfectly. The nightmare was over. The real life was just beginning.